At this very moment, in all corners of the globe, someone is either cheating or being cheated on. If there is a clear way to become a pariah in the modern day, it is to cheat on your partner. There are so few things that attract as much ire, as much indignation as an unfaithful lover. This is totally understandable. Infidelity causes an awful lot of pain. Some therapists have even come to associate it with PTSD symptoms. And what's more, it sometimes happens even when nothing seems wrong with the relationship in question. But, despite all this, there has not been a lot of systematic thinking about what makes people cheat, even when their relationships seem perfectly satisfactory. Can we look inside the head of the adulterer and see what makes them tick? Can we construct a loose philosophy of infidelity? Well, today I'll be doing just that, using two main sources. The fantastic book, The State of Affairs by psychotherapist Esther Perel, and the landmark novel Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, which for generations has stood the test of time as an empathetic yet uncompromising look at adultery. Get ready to learn the different factors that go into the cheater's psychology, what transgression and eroticism have in common, and how the lessons of a cheating spouse stretch far wider than merely the context of love. As always, bear in mind this is not a comprehensive guide to thinking around infidelity, and since it's a pretty understudied field, a lot of this will be relatively speculative. I mainly want to help spark your own thinking on the subject. I will also be focusing on adultery where there is no clear cause within the relationship, as I find this more mysterious and thus more interesting. But there is one way to avoid being cheated by your newsfeed, and that is today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans this QR code 40% off their Vantage Plan subscription. It's a fantastic deal and please do check it out. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on the recent interview of presidential candidate Kamala Harris by Fox News. Whereas left-wing sources tended to place her answers in pretty high esteem, with one even describing the interview as a great idea, right-wing publications called the whole thing a failure and were much more critical of Harris's performance. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs. In this case, left-wing news sources failed to cover Andrew Schultz predicting a Trump victory, while the right missed Ron DeSantis approving some changes to election procedure. I don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every single article I read for bias. So Ground News is fantastic for giving me an idea of the differences in reporting on different stories so that I can get a variety of views, rather than remaining stuck in my echo chamber. Go to ground.news/unsolicited or scan my QR code to subscribe today for 40% off the very same Vantage plan that I use for unlimited access to all of their features. Personally, I think Ground News is doing very important work, and I sincerely hope you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. 1. Imagination, expectations, and dissatisfaction. I have made a variety of videos on the topic of love on this channel, and a common theme in every one is how our imagination and our expectations interfere with the process of loving, both for the better and, unfortunately, for the worse. And unsurprisingly, this is also the case with infidelity. To set the scene, Madame Bovary follows Emma Bovary, a young woman who has married a medical man, Charles Bovary, in provincial France in the early 19th century. Emma had high hopes for marriage, having read a huge amount of romance literature in her youth, and Charles seemed a perfectly suitable match. He was an educated man in a promising profession, kind, honest, and straightforward. He met the expectations of what a middle-class European in the 19th century ought to be. And yet, when they are married, Emma finds that her lofty expectations are simply not being met. She was dreaming of a love to conquer all things, full of drama and passion, sacrifice and narrative. She pinned all her hopes for this on Charles, imagining that they would live in perpetual ardour for one another. But it quickly becomes clear this is not what married life with Charles will be. They have a perfectly pleasant union, yes, but it's not nearly enough to satisfy Emma, and she quickly turns elsewhere. Interestingly, Emma's infidelity begins in very small acts of imagination. Stuff most people would consider harmless, barely worth a mention. On one occasion, she and Charles are invited to a ball with some members of the French upper crust, and she finds herself entranced by a certain handsome vicomte. She does not act improperly at all, but she just lets her mind run wild at what life is like for him and what things might be like with him. She idolizes a particular existence that Charles cannot give her, but she imagines that the vicomte could. She pictures him riding, dancing, dining, and socializing. In her mind, he is unfailingly elegant and loquaciously eloquent. He is charming, kind, and romantic. He would never be as dull or unenticing as Charles. He is exciting, and their life together would be exciting. The French writer Stendhal, or the psychologist Dorothy Tennov, would say that Emma is crystallizing. She is using a tiny scrap of information to infer a whole range of things about the vicomte. And because he is not there for enough time to provide contradictory evidence, it is easy for her to believe that her judgments are accurate. She still firmly believes that her storybook romances with their faultless and effortless lovers and endless happiness can become a reality. She just believes she has been saddled with a man incapable of giving that to her. This crystallization is not just a theme of infidelity. It arguably happens quite a lot in the early stages of romance, as I've talked about on the channel before. The positive qualities of our beloved are amplified in our mind, while their negative ones are unconsciously overlooked. It is just that, in the case of infidelity, there is a built-in distance that can allow the imagination to flourish unimpeded. A key part of Marcel Proust's observations about love is that sometimes, paradoxically, the less attainable the person we desire is, the more we seek them. The fact that we cannot be with them inflames all the questions of what life would be like were we with them, which in turn kicks this crystallization process into overdrive. Perel also makes this observation about her patients. She observes that a subset of people engaged in affairs idolize the relationship they have with their affair partner. It becomes a case of pure but forbidden love. They are Lancelot and Guinevere, a true pairing that has only been thwarted by the cruelty of their circumstances. However, the fragility of this illusion often becomes all too apparent if they do get their wish and do end up together. Perel observes that many of her clients who leave their partner in order to turn their affair into a full-blown relationship end up single in a short time. It becomes evident that the story they told themselves about perfect star-crossed lovers was a lie, and their love quickly fades into disenchantment. We see this in Emma Bovary later in the novel, when she actually does begin having affairs. Her first full-blown lover is the roguish Rodolphe, who is consciously pursuing her but abandons her when she gets too close to him. She never fully gets to be with Rodolphe, as he does not truly love her. He is mainly using her for pleasure. Their affair lasts 4 whole years, and yet the grandeur of their romance never fades in Emma's eyes. She sees Rodolphe as a true romantic, someone with a sense for higher feelings. She is certain that if they were together, then it would be a love story like no other. She imagines them running off to some other country, spending their time in a romantic heaven with no one to disturb their love. He would be the fair Romeo to her coquettish Juliet, and they would live happily ever after. If only that blasted idiot Charles wasn't in the way. When Rodolphe does abandon Emma, she is truly distraught. She cannot imagine a life without him and falls into deep despair, mourning the loss of her extravagant fantasy. Let's contrast this with her later affair with a student named Leon. Leon does love Emma, and he makes it clear that he would happily have her. He idolizes her just as much as she idolizes him. He is not using her, but instead sees her as an angel who he barely deserves and will gladly give his right arm to be with her properly. As a result, him and Emma gradually spend more time together. And this is where things begin to fall apart. Emma gets just a little bit too much information about Leon, enough to dampen her imagination. They start to talk about things other than just their love. They become ever so slightly domestic, comfortable, calm. And thus, Emma loses interest. She wonders how she could have been so silly as to think Leon would be her romantic hero. Their affair falls apart not because Leon leaves in dramatic fashion like Rodolphe, but rather because they become disillusioned with one another. The pretense can no longer be maintained. And what else could we expect? Emma was never really in love with Leon, but rather the prospect of him fulfilling a fantastical expectation she had of love itself. To again draw from Proust, Emma's connections she had with her affair partners were never with them per se, but instead with some idea she had of them. She never loved anyone real, but instead only caricatures she had constructed for herself. like expertly made toys in a doll's house that's so beautiful you'd wish it were real. Of course, Emma has arguably started this whole thing off on the wrong foot. Alain de Botton would criticize her for having an idea of love that is already far too idealized. She had made the fatal mistake of only approaching it from the standpoint of what could be in an imaginary world, rather than what was actually there in front of her. As Perel and also many sociologists have noted, the expectations that we make of love or life can cause a sense of aggrieved entitlement if they have been set too high. We get a sense that we have been robbed of a promised life, deprived of some great destiny that we ought to have been given. In Bovary's case, her idea of a true romantic love was never going to be, and she ruined what might have been a much happier life in pursuit of it. We can look out for these tendencies in a romantic partner, but perhaps it is even more important to examine our own hearts, to see whether we are more like Madame Bovary than we initially considered. Setting expectations is a high-stakes game. Too low and someone could take advantage, but too high and happiness becomes a pretty far-off prospect. But next, I want to talk about something a bit more juicy. In all of this discussion, it is easy to bury some of the less savoury aspects of an affair. So let's not beat around the bush. Let's tackle one of the most uncomfortable properties of our psychology head on. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful patrons to support me and get access to exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. The Thrill of Transgression. In his book, Seductions of Crime, the sociologist Jack Katz suggests that we sometimes get a deep thrill out of doing something forbidden. In addition to all of the socio-economic factors that go into certain criminal actions, there is sometimes an accompanying excitement to enacting something that is both forbidden and risky. Some of us may have experienced this directly, though probably not in the context of crime. When we were children, many of us would have spent a certain amount of time deliberately disobeying our parents or teachers. Perhaps we cheated on a test or indulged in some rudeness to an authority figure. And if we did this may have come with an associated sense of thrill that we could get away with something. It is not just that we did something we wanted, but that we temporarily rebelled against what we were meant to do and asserted our independence onto the world. This is part of the appeal of anti-heroes or the Byronic hero. They can indulge wholeheartedly in this rebellion, and we can get some vicarious excitement from that. When we see John McClane as the renegade cop who doesn't play by the rules but damn it he gets results in Die Hard, part of the entertainment is this transgressive element. It would be a lot less engaging if he were just following procedure. We see this tendency reflected in Emma Bovary as well. While she spends some portion of the novel genuinely torn up about her affair, more often than not she is subtly reveling in it. At one point, her joy at being so deceptive and harbouring such a secret is described at length. We see this with both Rodolphe and Leon. In either case, it is partly the very fact that the relationship is clandestine that sets her soul ablaze. It is not that she is pursuing something in spite of it being forbidden, but rather because it is forbidden. This bears a strong relation to how she feels in her marriage and life more generally. She closely associates both with the feeling of being trapped. She only enjoys playing the figure of the virtuous wife when she knows this is a lie and she's actually a duplicitous adulteress. It is entirely possible that if Charles discovered the affairs and consented to them, seeming untroubled, then they would lose their appeal for her. It is partly the fact that she is living a double life that makes the whole thing so enticing for Emma. She views herself as a little spy, a nascent Machiavelli who has managed to get one over on a situation she sees as a cosmic injustice. Hell, in many ways her life is unfair, though most of us would probably not consider this to justify her affair. I'm not here to moralize, just to explore ideas. These observations by Flaubert mesh very well with what Perel has found in her practice. She talks about clients who embarked on their affair not because of any particular problem with their objective situation, but rather as just an act of revolt. This would explain why even opening a relationship is no defense against dishonesty and infidelity. Perel details many people who seem to go out of their way to sleep with someone that is specifically off-limits in the context of their arrangement. This makes no sense if it was just about the sex or the attention, but it becomes explicable if we view it through the lens of a deliberately exciting transgression. Perel also points out that the narrative of eroticism is often one of discovery or overcoming challenges. There is some obstacle to the love, which is then defeated, and there is this thrilling release at becoming victors over whatever was standing in the way of romance. In the early stages of any relationship, these occur naturally all the time. The possibility of rejection remains close at hand, and so every milestone and moment of connection already feels like a victory. But Perel observes that the transgressive nature of an affair makes it one of the only situations where this cycle of overcoming obstacles is continuous. They could be discovered any minute, and so they are constantly winning a little victory every time their affair is prolonged by another day. Perel says it's no wonder it can seem so intoxicating to the people involved. Again, none of this is to justify affairs. It's simply offering one way of explaining certain mysterious patterns of behavior. If there was one thinker who knew the thrill of transgression like no other, it was the Marquis de Sade. He made a total rebellion against any and all boundaries of morality or law the cornerstone of his philosophy. In works like Justine or Juliet, it is clear that he gets his kicks, both sexual and general, out of the very act of breaking some preconceived idea of what is good. And given his history, this is just what we might expect. He was imprisoned in the Bastille for many years, deprived of his freedom. Is it so surprising that he would jump to the other extreme in his philosophy? The feeling of being trapped gave him a deep resentment at any notion of constraint. If Emma felt similarly trapped and so similarly aggrieved, this goes some way to explaining her own transgressive actions. For those of us who have been stung by infidelity, this may offer a small comfort. In the aftermath of such a betrayal, it is easy to imagine that we are solely responsible. We must have done something in order to make this happen. In some cases, this might even be true, but it's also very easy to greatly overestimate our control in this situation. If our partner is thrilled simply by breaking such a treasured rule, there is not much we can do about that. This may be disempowering, but it is simultaneously relaxing. Like someone resigned to having been caught in the rain, we can move on with our lives without this constant worry that we brought this on ourselves. As the Stoics used to say, sometimes overestimating our power can cause just as much misery as underestimating it. But none of this answers the main question people often have when they're cheated on, which is, how could they do this to me? That is, how could they justify all of these lies and deceptions to themselves? How did they square it with their conscience? Well, I'm glad you asked. 3. Laundering Morality. On this channel, I talk a lot about how someone can convince themselves that they're doing a good thing or being a good person, even while flying in the face of their stated values or the values of the society they're a part of. How can it be that someone can have an affair and yet still consider themselves a good person or acting well? As we said at the start of the video, infidelity is one of the only things that will get almost everyone firmly abandoning your side. So what is the internal framework that allows someone to do that without burning up with cognitive dissonance? Well, we'll first look at the sorry case of Emma Bovary and then explore some wider ideas. For Emma, she largely seemed to resolve the conflict through two means, using passion itself as a justification and an imaginative demonization of Charles. The first is a surprisingly common cultural touchstone. Our culture is full of narratives where actions that we would ordinarily condemn are perceived as justified or otherwise dignified because of the addition of that all-important extra ingredient, love. We have the story of Lancelot and Guinevere that we already mentioned, along with Romeo and Juliet, where violence and deception in the name of love is so sympathetic we often skip straight to seeing it as noble. These tales only grow as we enter the Romantic and post-Romantic age. Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Puccini's Turandot, and even Madame Bovary itself. These stories may not say that violence or deception in the name of love is straightforwardly good, but they do make it more dignified. Emma has her own selection of romantic narratives from the novels she has read, and this is very much the lens through which she sees her affair. She is not just someone sneaking around and lying to those closest to her, she is doing it all in the name of love, and that makes a world of difference. At least in her eyes. During her and Rodolphe's conversations, they both say as much, reflecting that a powerful enough passion naturally frees itself from moral laws and becomes worthwhile in and of itself. As one of Perel's clients said, for them, their affair was not a betrayal, but the beginning of what they saw as a far nobler love story. Emma's other technique is to use that imagination we discussed in the first section to not just exalt her lover, but also demean Charles. She slowly begins to see everything he does as insufferable, from his perfectly respectable but unspectacular medical career to the way their house is decorated. She cannot stand anything even remotely associated with Charles. This sometimes even stretches to the child they have together. She calls him pathetic or mediocre, beneath her in 100 little ways. She turns even his straightforwardly positive qualities into something someone could reasonably hate. Rather than being attentive, she chooses to see him as cloying. Rather than his affection being warm, it is unmanly. Rather than appreciating the income he brings in, she minimizes it all as paltry. All of this is in service to her need to make her lovers justifiable to herself. The grain of truth in her assessment, that she is less than thrilled about the current state of her marriage, is itself amplified and crystallized to paint Charles as an unforgivable curse upon her life. Someone who deserves everything he gets. We see the contrast in the brief periods where Emma has no object to fixate her passions upon. Then she comes to see Charles in a much more sympathetic light. Then his successes seem greater, his caresses more inviting. When she no longer feels the need to demonize him, she allows herself to see his good qualities. But this is always short-lived. As soon as some cognitive dissonance needs resolving, she is right back to hating Charles. It is only on her deathbed that she finally realizes what she had. This also chimes nicely with some observations made by Perel. In a number of her accounts, she talks about how the two people having an affair sometimes discuss their primary partners in very negative terms. They might not outright demonize them, but they quite often subtly mock them or dismiss them, or otherwise minimize their quality or significance. Perel herself does not explore this in too much detail, but Flaubert's novel offers us one speculative explanatory theory. This maneuver does something psychologically important for the straying spouse. Condemning their partner makes their affair more sympathetic, more understandable. It minimizes the role of their own agency. Then the transgression becomes something that almost anyone would do in their situation. To draw upon Jean-Paul Sartre, it allows them to abdicate responsibility by acting in bad faith, pretending they were much less free than they were. Perel hits the nail on the head when she says that affairs enact a certain entitlement. They implicitly suggest that someone has the right to break the moral codes which bind polite society. So examining the kinds of strategies someone uses to justify this entitlement can be both interesting and philosophically productive. Other tactics Perel says people have used to minimize the agency they have in their affair is the dogged insistence that despite all the evidence, one is not that sort of person, that it is okay because of some particular fault with their partner, or that it is acceptable because it made them feel alive. In that last point, we again see the theme of a great passion allowing someone to justify an affair to themselves. On the whole, Perel puts this sort of thing down to a general human asymmetry when we are looking at injustices. We tend to emphasize the role of individual agency when judging other people, but instead think of external or environmental factors when we're examining our own misdeeds. What someone else does is a fault of their character, whereas what we do is simply the chaos of an unjust world pushing us into acting. Beyond this, Perel talks about how some people push the hurt their affair would cause firmly to the back of their minds while they were having it. They relished the excitement of breaking a rule, but consciously did not think about how it would upset their partner. This was a truth they found too difficult to look at. It is a bit like how historians sometimes describe soldiers who commit war crimes getting incredibly drunk after the fact. The wish they have to put themselves at a remove from the hurt they have caused is reasonably commonplace. And when the situation is inflamed by strong emotions like love and lust, this sort of bootstrap self-justification is certainly something to watch out for. But lastly, I want to somewhat broaden this discussion. Because the same sorts of mental patterns that lead to adultery reflect wider philosophical ideas that can prevent us from finding happiness in any domain of our lives. And so I want to end by talking about what an adulterous approach to life itself would consist of. 4. Existential adultery. I think one of the most interesting themes in how people approach adultery is that it is often seen as entirely divorced from wider approaches to life. We stop at simply characterizing adultery as spiteful and selfish. However, the ingredients that go into adultery strike me as very similar to observations made by philosophers over the centuries about general existential approaches. And in this way, the adulterer can bring into focus some aspects of our own philosophy of life that we may wish to reconsider. The first thing to note is that the unrealistic expectations someone like Emma has about love can easily be had about existence as well. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche used to talk about cycles of naivety, disillusionment, nihilism, and then finding a new illusion to cling on to. Here, he was talking about how people might leap from one dogmatic source of meaning in their lives to the next, each time becoming slowly disillusioned and nihilistic before reviving their illusions with a whole new approach. That, in turn, will fall apart. For Nietzsche, this was to avoid an unbearable truth about life, that there will always be suffering and that we must learn to make that suffering meaningful, and moreover, there is no objective framework that will do that for us. Schopenhauer warned against expectations in a similar vein. He said it was the raging of the will to desire greater and greater things that can cause us extreme misery in the long term. Emma could not be content with building up her relationship with Charles to something magnificent, but rather wanted the trappings of a storybook romance right then and there. This was never going to happen with anyone long term, but she had yet to realize it. So, rather than learning to restrain her will, as Schopenhauer might recommend, it continued to roam free, causing her to lust after anything that promised to fulfill that fantasy. We could also view Emma's non-committal attitude through the lens of someone like Kierkegaard. For him, many people remain in the aesthetic way of looking at the world for their entire life. This is a complex concept, but for our purpose, it is broadly characterized by two things. The first is a priority given to one's own feelings and perspective on an issue above anything else. And the second is an inability to commit to a single path in life. Kierkegaard paints the human condition as one tormented by choice. There are so many things we could do, so many lives we could live, and yet by the end we will have only ever lived one. Likewise, Perel presents many of her patients as using their affairs to try to live new lives or revive old ones. This sort of non-commitment might be a short-term balm to ease the pain of aging, and yet Kierkegaard would say it is a disaster in the long term. He suggests it is only through commitment that we can ease our angst about the dizziness of freedom and push through to fully engage with what life has to offer. For him, any endeavor, be it in love or work or thought, requires a leap of faith. This is not necessarily faith that this would be the best life we ever could live, but rather a continual choice to pursue this course through and commit to it with mind, body, and spirit. However, this is no small task. The trouble is that we'll be comparing what actually is to what possibly could be. But what is possible is a vast, infinite landscape, rich with vivid imaginings and verdant fantasies. Whereas we know what is actual, it is right there in front of us, with all of its imperfections and blemishes. And yet, avoiding the allure of possibility is part of what Kierkegaard thinks makes a fulfilling life. In this way, the adulterer is applying a worldview that many of us fall into from time to time, but just in the specific domain of love. Thirdly, it is worth being aware of the general tendency to get a kick out of transgression so that we can carefully consider just when we want to transgress and which rules we want to leave firmly intact. An observation Perel makes of the clients who have an affair specifically in order to break a rule is that they often feel trapped and constrained in the rest of their lives. Both Jacques Lacan and Erich Fromm corroborate this idea. They suggest that when we feel as if our lives are out of our hands, or that our autonomy is being constrained by social rules, then we may start transgressing just to remind ourselves that we're a free agent. If we accept this view, then part of controlling the thrill of transgression is to actually allow ourselves a bit more freedom. This does not mean that we should let people have affairs, but rather Perel suggests we should consider other aspects of our lives that might make us feel boxed in. Or as Kierkegaard might put it, suffering from a lack of possibilities. Transgressing these rules might have a similar effect of reassuring us of our agency and ability, but without causing our world or relationship to collapse. Coupled with the previous point made by Kierkegaard, we can think of maintaining a balance between commitment and enough freedom to allay our fears of being trapped. That is, we can commit to things wholeheartedly, while still recognizing this is our choice. Obviously, the balance here will be totally individual. Lastly, Emma's ability to justify her affair by demonizing Charles is worth some careful thought. We like to think of our judgments on our position, relationships, and more as simply considerations of the facts. We are taking into account all of the evidence available to us and coming to a rational conclusion. However, the case of justifying affairs reminds us of just how manipulable our minds can be, and how carefully they will guard any belief we are already heavily invested in. At some level, we probably know this. The idea of someone being in denial is not unfamiliar to us. But at the same time, how often do we truly sit and examine where our willingness to protect our treasured view of ourselves conflicts with how we actually act in the world? How often do we say, "That's not like me," when reality would certainly beg to differ? How often do we attribute blame to other people while reserving forgiveness and compassion for ourselves? I don't mean to condemn anyone for this. I think almost all of us do it to a greater or lesser extent. But I do think it is worth reflecting upon. History is littered with monsters who were sure they were doing the right thing, and broken relationships are full of people who claim they never did anything to contribute to their dissolution. Considering this, perhaps a bit of epistemic humility in our own judgments is warranted here. I'm not suggesting that we can't be perfectly right about our ideas of ourselves and our situation, just that our first glance views might leave a lot of valuable information completely out of the equation. Surely part of the value of learning and practicing a philosophical approach to life is so that we can take our own views of the world and our lives and put them up to careful scrutiny. Arguably, Emma Bovary's fatal flaw, above all else, was her failure to question her own view on the world and on love. Her passions went totally unexamined, and even if we think the unexamined life is still worth living, it strikes me as a much riskier approach. Perhaps when love goes so badly wrong, we should pay careful attention. Just like an autopsy can tell us a lot about the process of a death, an affair can teach us a lot about what kills love. And, even more importantly, what robs us of a fulfilling life. But if you want to explore some of these ideas in more detail and see my general examination of modern love, then click here to watch just that. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a wonderful day.